When you spend enough time in the backcountry, you learn that most of the problems people run into out there come from small mistakes stacking up. Bad weather forecast ignored, wrong gear, no backup light, a map they barely know how to read. I'm not reckless about that kind of thing. I studied environmental science in college, and most of my free time ends up outside anyway. Backpacking is how I reset when everything else gets loud. The planning is part of the routine for me, checking weather patterns, marking water sources, packing redundancy where it matters. It doesn't make you invincible, but it removes a lot of unnecessary risk. That's why the fire tower seemed like a good idea at the time. This happened in July of 2022, outside Elk City in Idaho. That part of the state has huge stretches of forest where the trails thin out fast the farther you go. Old logging roads, ridge lines, and occasionally structures that were built decades ago for fire lookouts and then abandoned when the systems changed. Some of those towers are still standing. I had seen this one marked on an old topographic map before the trip. It wasn't listed as an official lookout anymore, just a square icon that suggested there had once been something there. I wasn't counting on it being usable. Most abandoned towers collapse or get removed, but if it was still standing, it could give me a dry place to sit out a storm. The weather forecast had been stable all week until the afternoon before I left. A slow-moving system was pushing in from the west. Nothing severe, just steady rain and wind through the higher elevations. That kind of weather isn't dangerous if you're prepared. It just makes everything uncomfortable. I hiked in early that morning with a full pack and a plan to reach the ridge before evening. The trail started as a wide dirt road, but narrowed quickly into a faint path through thick pine. By midday, the forest had that deep quiet you get when there's no traffic noise anywhere within miles. I stopped around noon near a creek crossing, filtered water, and checked my map again. The tower should have been less than 2 miles ahead, up a gradual climb along the ridge. The clouds were already building by the time I reached it. The tower appeared through the trees gradually, like a shape your brain has to confirm a few times before it believes it. 4 tall wooden legs anchored into concrete footings rising above the tree line. The lookout cabin that would have sat at the top decades ago was gone, but the platform and railings were still there. The ladder ran up one side, broken into sections with small resting platforms every 20 feet or so. It looked old but stable. I walked around the base first before deciding anything. The ground was packed dirt with patches of gravel and pine needles. I didn't see any recent tire tracks or obvious trash. The wood of the supports had weathered gray, but the structure didn't feel fragile when I touched it. One detail caught my eye, though. Near one of the railings up top, something bright reflected in the light. When I climbed halfway up and looked closer, I saw it was a new zip tie securing a loose piece of metal mesh. It looked much newer than the rest of the tower. I assumed someone from the Forest Service had done a quick repair at some point, or maybe hikers had secured it to stop it rattling. It didn't bother me enough to reconsider using the platform. By then, the wind had picked up noticeably. The clouds overhead were thickening into the dull gray sheet that usually means rain is about an hour away. Sleeping on the ground that night would mean wet grass, insects, and possibly muddy runoff if the storm settled in. Sleeping on a dry platform 10 or 15 feet above the ground sounded much better. I climbed the rest of the ladder with my pack and stepped onto the top platform. From up there, you could see the forest stretching in every direction, ridge after ridge fading into blue distance. It was exactly the kind of quiet place I had hoped for. I dropped my pack, checked the railing, and sat down to eat something before the rain started. The first thing I noticed up there was a faint smell of smoke. Not fresh smoke, more like the lingering smell left behind after someone has had a small fire somewhere nearby earlier in the day. I stood and leaned over the railing, scanning the tree canopy. No visible smoke column, no flicker of flame. It might have been someone miles away burning brush or a campfire drifting through the trees. That happens sometimes when wind carries scent farther than you expect. I set up my sleeping pad and bag near the center of the platform where the railing would break the wind a little. By the time the first drops of rain started tapping against the wood, I was already inside my sleeping bag reading with my headlamp. The rain settled into a steady rhythm over the next hour. It wasn't heavy, but it was persistent enough that climbing down the ladder in the dark would have been slippery and unpleasant. I was glad I had chosen to stay up there. Around midnight, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. The forest below the tower went quiet in that deep way it does after rain passes through. No wind, no dripping branches, just the occasional distant movement of an animal somewhere out in the trees. I turned off my headlamp and lay back, looking up at the sky. The clouds were breaking apart slowly, revealing patches of stars. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a metallic creak from somewhere below. It wasn't loud, just a short sound like wood shifting under weight. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The tower sometimes made small noises when the wind moved through it earlier in the evening. But this didn't sound like wind. I rolled slightly onto one elbow and looked toward the ladder opening. The forest below was dark, except for the faint glow of starlight. Then I saw the light. A narrow flashlight beam appeared on the ground beneath the tower. It moved slowly across the dirt, sweeping along the base of one of the support legs. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was relief. Another hiker must have come across the tower and decided to check it out. That happens sometimes with structures like this. People are curious. I leaned slightly toward the railing and said quietly, "Hello?" The flashlight stopped moving. For a moment, it stayed pointed at the ground. Then it moved again. But instead of angling upward toward the sound of my voice, it continued moving in a slow circle around the base of the tower. The beam traced along the supports, the ladder, the ground, then disappeared behind one of the legs before reappearing on the other side. No voice answered. I waited for someone to say something. Nothing. The beam completed the circle and started another. Same pace, same path. I told myself the person probably hadn't heard me. Maybe the rain had muffled my voice, or maybe they were focused on navigating in the dark. I spoke again, louder this time. "Hey, there's someone up here." The beam stopped again for a few seconds, then it resumed moving. Still no voice. That was the moment the situation began to feel slightly off. Most people, if they realize someone is above them in a tower, will look up or say something back. This person did neither. The beam continued circling. Once, twice, 3 times. Each loop took maybe a minute. After the 4th loop, I noticed something else. The light never pointed upward. It stayed at ground level the entire time, sweeping the base of the tower like someone inspecting it, checking the supports, the ladder, the area around the base. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders and stayed still. A small part of my brain began working through explanations. Maybe it was someone from the Forest Service checking the structure. Maybe it was another hiker who didn't want to startle me by shining a light in my face. But even those explanations didn't quite fit the behavior. If someone was inspecting the tower, why do it silently in the middle of the night? The circling continued for what felt like a long time. I tried checking my watch at one point, but couldn't see it clearly without turning on my headlamp, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Eventually, the beam disappeared behind the tower and didn't return. The forest went dark again. I lay there listening for footsteps moving away. I didn't hear any. I must have drifted in and out of sleep after that, because the next clear moment I remember was the pale light of dawn spreading across the trees. The forest looked normal again. Quiet. Still. For several minutes I lay there, convincing myself that whatever had happened during the night was probably harmless. Another camper exploring the area, someone passing through. People behave strangely sometimes when they're alone in the woods. Eventually, I sat up and packed my sleeping bag. The ladder was directly across the platform from where I had slept. I walked toward it and looked down. At first, my brain didn't register what I was seeing. The ladder section that should have been closest to the ground was gone. The lowest metal segment had been removed from the structure. The ladder now ended about 8 feet above the dirt. I gripped the railing and leaned out farther. The missing section was lying on the ground several feet away from the base of the tower. It had been unbolted and set aside. My chest felt tight in a quiet, practical way. That ladder hadn't fallen off. Someone had taken it down. And the only time they could have done that was while I was sleeping above them. I run wilderness survival courses outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Most of the people who sign up for my classes are hikers or campers who want to feel more prepared when they head into remote areas. We teach practical things: navigation, fire building, water sourcing, shelter setups, and how to think through a problem instead of panicking when something unexpected happens. Part of that training involves solo overnight trips. You don't really understand how you react to isolation until you've spent time alone in the woods with no distractions. I do those trips myself regularly, so I can keep my skills sharp and test gear in real conditions. That's what I was doing in September of 2022. The weather in northern Arizona that time of year is ideal for it. Cool nights, dry air, and clear skies most of the time. The forests outside Flagstaff are dense enough to feel remote, but familiar enough that you can move through them comfortably if you know the terrain. I picked a spot I had used before. It was about 4 miles off a logging road, down a narrow trail that wound through ponderosa pines and patches of open ground. The area had a small clearing near a seasonal wash where I usually set up camp. I arrived in the late afternoon and went through my normal routine. First, I checked the ground for anthills and loose rocks. Then I set my pack near a fallen log and walked a quick perimeter to see if there were any signs of recent activity. Old footprints, trash, anything that suggested someone else had been through recently. I didn't see anything. The place looked exactly the way I remembered it. I built a small cooking fire using dry branches from around the clearing and boiled water for a simple meal. After that, I spent an hour going over notes for a course I was planning the following month. The sun dropped behind the trees earlier than expected, and the temperature cooled quickly once the light faded. By the time I finished cleaning up my gear and hanging my food bag, the forest had settled into that quiet nighttime rhythm. If you spend enough nights outdoors, you start to recognize the normal sounds: wind in the canopy, small animals moving through leaves, occasional distant calls from owls. When those sounds stay consistent, it usually means nothing unusual is happening nearby. I placed my camp knife in the usual spot before turning in. It's a habit I developed years ago. The knife sits in its sheath on the ground just to the right of where I sleep. That way I can reach it without fumbling if I need it quickly. It's not about expecting trouble, it's just a simple piece of preparedness. The knife itself isn't anything fancy. A fixed blade tool I've carried for years. I use it for everything from food prep to carving tent stakes. Because of that, I know exactly where it is at all times. That's why I noticed it immediately the next morning. I woke up shortly after sunrise. The air was cool enough that a thin mist hung in the low areas near the wash. I stretched, sat up, and reached toward the ground where the knife should have been. My hand closed on empty dirt. I looked down. The sheath was gone too. For a moment, I thought I had moved it the night before. That happens occasionally when I'm half asleep, setting something down and not remembering exactly where. I checked the other side of my sleeping pad. Nothing. I leaned forward and looked around the fire ring. Nothing there either. I stood up and started searching the immediate area carefully. The knife wasn't small. If it had fallen or been kicked aside, it would have been easy to spot among the pine needles and dirt. I circled the camp slowly. Under the log, near my pack, beside the fire pit. No knife. At that point, I paused and went through the logical possibilities. First, I never brought it. That didn't hold up because I clearly remembered using it to shave a piece of wood for kindling before bed. Second, I placed it somewhere else. Possible but unlikely. My routines are consistent enough that I rarely change them. Third, an animal carried it off. Animals do take things sometimes if they smell food residue, but a knife in a sheath isn't something most animals would bother with. I searched again, widening the circle around camp. Still nothing. It bothered me more than I expected. Not because I couldn't function without it. I had other tools in my pack. But the disappearance didn't fit any of the usual explanations. After about 20 minutes of searching, I stopped and forced myself to step back mentally. One of the things I teach students is that when something small goes wrong in the field, you don't let it spiral into a bigger distraction. You reassess and move on. I decided the knife would turn up eventually. Maybe I had kicked it farther than I realized during the night. I packed up the camp slowly and began hiking toward a ridge about half a mile away where I planned to do some navigation exercises. The trail leading there was narrow but easy to follow. The morning sun filtered through the trees, lighting patches of the forest floor in long strips of gold. For the first few minutes of walking, I was mostly focused on scanning the ground ahead out of habit. That's when I saw the knife. It was about 30 yards down the trail, stuck upright in the dirt. For a second, my brain didn't process it correctly. It looked almost like someone had planted a small metal flag in the ground. As I got closer, the details became clear. The handle was angled slightly toward me. The blade was buried about 2 inches into the soil. My sheath was wrapped around the base. I stopped walking. The forest around me was silent in the same way it had been all morning. No footsteps behind me, no movement in the trees. I approached the knife slowly and crouched down. The blade was clean. There was no dirt smeared along the handle like it had been dropped or kicked into place. It looked like someone had pressed it carefully into the ground. The orientation made something else obvious. The tip of the blade was pointing back toward the direction of my campsite. I stood there for a moment, trying to think through the logistics. The knife had been beside me while I slept. Then it disappeared. Then it appeared on the trail ahead of me. Not randomly placed, but positioned upright in a way that suggested someone expected me to find it, which meant someone had been close enough to my camp during the night to take it, and close enough to the trail that morning to put it back before I arrived. I pulled the knife out of the dirt and examined it. The edge was still sharp. No scratches, no damage. I wiped the blade on my pant leg and slid it back into the sheath. Then I stood there listening again. The forest remained quiet. It's difficult to describe the feeling that followed. It wasn't panic, more like a shift in the way my brain evaluated the environment. Up until that moment, the woods had felt empty. Now they felt occupied. I looked back down the trail toward the direction of my camp. Nothing moved between the trees. If someone had placed the knife there, they had done it without leaving obvious tracks. The ground in that area was mostly pine needles and dry soil, which doesn't hold footprints well unless the soil is damp. I scanned the tree line on both sides of the trail. Still nothing. Part of me considered continuing with my planned route. But another part of me, the part that teaches people not to ignore signs, recognized that the situation had changed. Someone had interacted with my gear while I was asleep. Then they had arranged the knife where I would find it. That wasn't random. That was communication. I slipped the knife back onto my belt instead of leaving it in my pack. Then I turned around and walked back toward my campsite. The clearing looked exactly the way I had left it earlier. No visible disturbance. My fire ring was cold. My pack had been zipped shut. If someone had been there recently, they hadn't touched anything else. I did one more slow circuit of the area. No footprints, no broken branches, no cigarette butts or wrappers, just the same quiet forest I had arrived in the day before. Eventually, I repacked my gear and started hiking out. Not running, not rushing, just moving with more awareness than before. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen. The woods remained still. I didn't see another person the entire hike back to the logging road. When I reached my truck, I sat there for a few minutes with the engine off. I turned the knife over in my hand again. It looked exactly the way it always had, but the fact that someone had taken it and then decided when to return it kept replaying in my head. It changed the way I thought about the previous night. The moment when I had been asleep beside the fire, the quiet of the forest, the assumption that no one else was nearby. All of that had been wrong. Whoever placed that knife in the trail had been close enough to watch me without being noticed, and they had chosen not to reveal themselves. I still teach wilderness courses. I still spend nights alone in the forest. But when students ask me why it's important to stay aware of small details in the backcountry, I sometimes think about that knife standing upright in the dirt, because preparation helps with a lot of things. but it doesn't account for someone deciding they want you to know they were there. If anything, the longer you spend out there, the more you understand how quickly things can turn if you're careless. But you also learn the patterns. You know what a real campfire looks like through trees. You know what animals sound like at night. You know the difference between a branch snapping because of wind and something stepping on it. That familiarity is what made the whole thing so unsettling later. I grew up around the mountains near Hiawassee, Georgia. My dad hunted, my uncles hunted, and most of my weekends as a kid were spent somewhere in the woods with them. By the time I was in my 20s, I was comfortable moving around out there alone. In November of 2019, I took a short solo trip up into a section of national forest a few miles outside town. It was late in the season, right when the leaves had mostly fallen, but the winter cold hadn't fully set in yet. That time of year, the woods feel more open because you can see farther through the trees. My plan was simple: drive up the gravel access road, hike a couple miles in, set up a small camp near a creek I'd used before, and spend the evening scouting for deer sign. I'd stay the night and head back the next day. Nothing about the trip felt unusual when I started. The drive-in was quiet. The road twisted through the hills with long stretches where you couldn't see another vehicle for miles. By the time I parked and started hiking, the afternoon light was already starting to soften through the branches. The trail I followed wasn't an official one, more like a worn path people had used over the years. It ran along a ridge for a while before dropping toward a narrow valley where the creek cut through. I reached the clearing near the water around 4 in the afternoon. It was the same place I'd used before, flat ground between 2 large trees, close enough to the creek for water, but high enough that flooding wouldn't be a problem if rain moved in overnight. I dropped my pack and started setting up. My setup was simple: small tent, cooking kit, headlamp, the usual gear. I collected some dry branches nearby and built a small fire ring with stones already scattered around the clearing. Within half an hour, I had everything arranged the way I liked it. The fire crackled quietly while I heated up a simple meal. The smell of wood smoke drifted upward through the branches, and the last light of the afternoon settled across the clearing. It was the kind of calm evening that makes the woods feel almost peaceful. After I ate, I grabbed my jacket and decided to walk a little farther up the ridge before it got too dark, just scouting. I followed the slope upward, moving slowly so I wouldn't make too much noise. Leaves covered most of the ground, but they were dry enough that careful steps kept the sound down. The forest had that late autumn smell to it: damp earth, fallen leaves, and the faint scent of pine. I had walked maybe 15 minutes away from my camp when I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was just sunlight catching on something. But the color was wrong. It had that orange flicker that only comes from fire. I stopped and looked more carefully through the trees. About 100 yards ahead, deeper between the trunks, a steady glow lit the forest floor. A campfire. That wasn't strange on its own. Plenty of people camp in that area during hunting season. But the location was odd. There weren't any established campsites where that glow was coming from. No clearings that I knew of, at least. Still, someone could have just picked a spot and built a fire. I stood there for a moment listening. Normally, when you get close to someone else's camp, you hear something besides the fire. Voices, gear moving around, maybe a radio playing softly. This time there was nothing, just the faint flicker of orange light. I stepped off the faint trail and started moving toward it. I wasn't sneaking exactly, but I kept my steps careful out of habit. As I got closer, the glow became brighter between the trees. The flicker looked exactly like a normal fire, the way flames move when they're burning through small branches. I remember thinking it might be another hunter. If it was, I'd say hello and move along so I didn't disturb them. When I was about 30 yards away, I called out, "Hey there." No answer. The glow continued flickering the same way. I took a few more steps forward. The ground there dipped slightly into a small hollow between trees. When I stepped down into it, the view opened up enough that I should have been able to see the fire directly. Instead, the light disappeared. Not faded, disappeared. The forest in front of me was dark. I stopped walking. For a moment, I wondered if I had just moved behind a tree or something that blocked my line of sight. I took 2 steps to the side. Still nothing. No glow. No fire. I moved forward to the spot where the light should have been. The ground there was covered with leaves like the rest of the forest. No ash. No burned branches. No smoke. I crouched down and brushed a few leaves aside with my hand. The dirt underneath was cold and undisturbed. If a fire had been there recently, even for a few minutes, there would have been signs. Burn marks. Warm soil. Something. There was nothing. I stood there, turning slowly in a circle. The trees around me looked exactly the same as when I arrived. Just trunks, fallen leaves, and fading daylight. I waited another minute, listening. The woods were quiet. Eventually, I told myself I must have misjudged the distance or angle. Maybe the fire was farther away than it looked through the trees. Light can play tricks in the woods, especially near sunset. I climbed back up the small rise and scanned the area again. No glow anywhere. By then, the sky was darkening enough that I didn't want to wander farther from camp, trying to solve the mystery. I turned around and started heading back toward the clearing. The walk back felt longer than the walk out. The forest had shifted into evening mode. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the hills. When I reached the clearing, my fire was still burning low in the ring where I'd left it, but something else caught my attention immediately. My backpack was open. I had zipped it closed before leaving. Not just loosely closed, fully zipped. Now the top flap was folded back, and one of the side pockets hung open. I walked toward it slowly. The firelight flickered across the ground as I knelt beside the pack. At first glance, nothing looked stolen. My water bottle was still there. My extra jacket was still rolled up at the bottom. But several items had been moved. My small cooking pot had been taken out and placed beside the pack. The bag of trail mix I kept near the top had been moved into the outer pocket, and my headlamp was sitting on the ground a few feet away, not scattered, placed. That detail bothered me more than if the gear had been dumped out. It looked like someone had taken the time to examine things and then arrange them again. I stood up and scanned the edge of the clearing. The trees were dark now. Whatever light had been left in the sky had faded into a dull gray through the branches. I listened for movement. Nothing. My heart was beating faster than it had earlier, but I kept my breathing steady. I've been around animals enough to know what animal disturbance looks like. Animals don't unzip backpacks. They tear things open. They drag food away. They leave obvious signs. This looked like someone had calmly gone through my gear. Then I saw the bandana. It was tied to one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. Bright red fabric against dark bark. I walked over and looked closer. It was my bandana. I had packed it earlier that day in the outer pocket of my bag. Now it was tied neatly around the trunk of the tree facing my tent. The knot was simple and tight, like someone had taken care to secure it properly. The fabric hung at eye level, facing directly toward where my tent sat. I stood there for a long moment looking at it. The fire behind me crackled softly. The forest around the clearing stayed silent. I untied the bandana slowly and held it in my hand. It smelled like wood smoke from earlier in the evening. Nothing else. I walked back to the pack and started putting everything away again. Not rushing, but moving faster than before. The entire time I packed, I kept glancing toward the trees. The thought kept repeating in my head. Someone had been here while I was gone. Not passing through. Not stealing. Just watching long enough to know when I left. Then going through my gear and leaving something behind where I would definitely see it. The fire I had seen earlier came back into my mind. The glow between the trees, the way it vanished when I got close. At the time, it had seemed confusing. Now it felt like something else entirely. A distraction, something meant to pull me away from camp. I finished packing and shouldered the backpack. The smart decision would have been to stay the night and leave in the morning. But standing in that clearing, looking at the tree where the bandana had been tied, I knew I wasn't staying there. I kicked dirt over the fire until the last embers disappeared. Then I switched on my headlamp and started hiking back toward the trail. The woods felt different in the dark. Every sound carried farther. Leaves shifting under my boots seemed louder than usual. I walked steadily without stopping until I reached the ridge path again. The whole time I kept expecting to hear footsteps somewhere behind me. But the forest stayed quiet all the way back to the truck. Even now, years later, I still think about that glow between the trees and the bandana tied neatly to the trunk facing my tent. Because whoever did that didn't need to take anything. They just wanted me to know they had been there. Camping has been something I've done regularly for years. Not survivalist level trips, but plenty of nights in remote areas. Enough that I'm comfortable being far from roads and cell service. In August of 2021, 2 friends and I planned a weekend trip outside Bend, Oregon. Both of them had similar experience outdoors. One of them had done long-distance backpacking trips in Washington, and the other had grown up camping with family every summer. None of us were new to it. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday afternoon, hike a couple miles off a Forest Service road, set up camp near a small lake we'd seen marked on a map, and spend the weekend hiking around the area. The first part of the trip went exactly as expected. The road into the forest was dusty and narrow, but easy to follow. After parking near the trailhead, we shouldered our packs and started walking. The trail itself wasn't heavily used. It wound through tall pines with long stretches where the ground was covered in soft needles instead of dirt. The air smelled like sun-warmed sap and dry earth. We hiked for about an hour before reaching the lake. It was smaller than it had looked on the map, more like a wide pond surrounded by trees. But it was quiet and flat enough to make a good campsite. We picked a spot about 50 yards from the water and started setting up. One person collected firewood while the other 2 set up tents. Within half an hour, we had a small fire going and our gear laid out the way we liked it. The evening passed the way camping evenings usually do. We cooked a simple meal, sat around the fire talking, and watched the light fade through the trees. By the time the sky turned dark, the temperature had cooled enough that we pulled our jackets tighter and added a few more branches to the fire. At some point during the conversation, one of my friends stood up and stretched. "I'm going to walk around a little," he said. Not unusual. When you've been sitting for a while, it's nice to move around. He grabbed a headlamp and wandered off toward the edge of the trees. A few minutes later, he called quietly back toward us. "Hey, come look at this." The tone of his voice wasn't alarmed, but it had that curious edge to it. The other friend and I stood up and walked over. He was standing near a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed down the path. "There's another campsite back there," he said. That wasn't surprising. Plenty of people wander off trail to find quieter spots. We followed the path for maybe 30 yards until the trees opened into a small clearing. That's where we saw it, a campsite, but not the kind most campers leave behind. The ground had several blankets laid out flat across the dirt. Not sleeping bags, actual blankets spread side by side like someone had arranged them deliberately. Next to them was a neat stack of empty cans, not tossed into a pile the way people usually leave trash, stacked carefully. There was no tent, no backpack, no cooler, no lantern, just the blankets and the cans. I stepped forward slowly, scanning the clearing. "Hello?" I called. No answer. The forest around us stayed quiet. One of my friends walked around the edge of the clearing. "Maybe someone stepped away," he said. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. People wander off from camp to collect firewood or use the bathroom all the time. Still, something about the setup felt strange. The blankets were arranged in a way that didn't look temporary, more like they had been placed there intentionally and left that way for a while. And the cans were stacked in a way that felt deliberate. I crouched near them and counted without touching, at least a dozen, all empty, all clean enough that they hadn't been sitting out for months. I stood up and looked at the others. "You think someone lives here?" I asked quietly. "Maybe," one of them said, "like someone camping out long term." That thought made the situation feel different. It's one thing to stumble across another group of hikers. It's another thing to realize you might have wandered into someone's living space. We waited another minute. Still no movement. Still no voices. Eventually, one of my friends shrugged. "If someone's around, they'll come back," he said. "Let's head back to our site." None of us argued. We walked back along the path and returned to our fire. For a while, we kept talking like normal, but the mood had shifted slightly. The discovery of that other campsite sat in the back of our minds. Not frightening exactly, just strange. After another hour or so, we decided to turn in for the night. We put out the fire, zipped our food bags closed, and climbed into our tents. My tent faced the tree line opposite the lake. I remember lying there, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest settling down. Occasionally, a branch cracked somewhere in the distance. An owl called once or twice, the kind of normal nighttime noises you hear when camping. I must have fallen asleep for a while because the next thing I remember was waking up to a faint sound outside the tent. Footsteps. Soft ones. Moving through the pine needles. At first, I assumed it was one of my friends stepping out to use the bathroom. But the footsteps didn't move away from the tents. They moved around them. Slowly. A few seconds later, I heard the same soft steps pass along the other side of my tent. Not close enough to brush the fabric, but close enough that I could tell someone was walking a circle around our campsite. I stayed still inside my sleeping bag. My brain started running through possibilities. Maybe it was a deer. But deer move differently. Their steps are uneven, and usually accompanied by small rustling sounds from brushing against branches. These footsteps were measured, even, human. I reached quietly toward the side pocket of my sleeping bag and grabbed my headlamp. I didn't turn it on yet. The footsteps continued, one full loop around the tents. Then they stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the steps started again. Another slow circle. The person never spoke, never came close enough to touch the tents. Just walked the perimeter. I could hear the faint crunch of needles under each step. My heart was beating faster now, but I kept breathing slowly. After the second loop, the steps stopped near the side of my tent. I could sense someone standing there, not moving, just standing. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if they were listening for movement inside. None of us unzipped our tents. None of us spoke. Eventually, the footsteps moved away again. They circled once more, farther out this time. Then they faded into the forest. I lay there for several minutes waiting for them to return. They didn't. A few minutes later, I heard the zipper of one of the other tents open quietly. A whisper came from the darkness. "You awake?" It was one of my friends. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Did you hear that?" "Yes." The third friend answered from the other tent. "I heard it too." None of us needed to explain what we meant. We all knew someone had been walking around the campsite. We decided not to stay there until morning. Instead, we packed as quietly as possible in the dark. Sleeping bags stuffed quickly, packs zipped, headlamps kept dim so the light wouldn't carry too far through the trees. Within 10 minutes, we were walking back toward the trail. No one spoke until we were a good distance from the lake. Even then, the conversation stayed short. "Think it was someone from that other camp?" one of them asked. "Probably," another answered. But the way the footsteps had moved around our tents kept replaying in my mind. Slow, measured, watching. Whoever it was hadn't tried to approach us directly. They had just circled, like they were checking something. Even now, when I think about that night, the part that stays with me the most isn't the footsteps themselves. It's the campsite we found earlier. The blankets laid out, the cans stacked neatly, and the feeling that when we walked through that clearing, we had already stepped into someone else's territory without realizing it. If you're working toward a ranger job, people assume you understand trails, closures, weather, and what belongs in a place and what doesn't. Even when you're still training, you're expected to move through the woods like you have a plan. That was the headspace I was in during my ranger trainee period near Asheville in May of 2024. Most of my assignments were routine. Fence checks, signage, reporting down trees, keeping an eye on areas that get heavy weekend use. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked it. I liked having a job where good work meant noticing small details and documenting them properly. One of the areas I was assigned to that month included an older ranger cabin that had been closed for years. It wasn't a visitor cabin, and it wasn't a rental. It had been used decades ago as a seasonal station, then mothballed when the district reorganized. The building still stood because taking it down would cost money and effort, and it wasn't close enough to a main road to be a constant problem. My supervisor's instructions were clear. Check the exterior condition, make sure the closure signage was intact, and make note of any new damage or signs that someone had been messing with it. Don't go inside, she told me. If the door is compromised, you document it and we handle it as a separate issue. I remember nodding like it was obvious. I wasn't out there to play explorer. I had a checklist, and I intended to stick to it. The trail to the cabin wasn't long, but it was remote enough that you didn't stumble onto it by accident. It was off a spur path that most hikers never take because it doesn't lead to a waterfall or a viewpoint. It led to an old structure and then stopped. That day was warm for May. The woods were green in a way that made everything feel alive. You could hear insects in the brush and birds moving around overhead. The ground was dry, and my boots made that soft crunch sound on old leaves. I carried my normal gear: radio, first aid kit, headlamp, water, a small notebook, and a backup battery. Not because I expected trouble, because that's what you do when you're working alone in a district where cell service is inconsistent. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I did was walk the perimeter like I'd been trained. The building was small, single story, with a shallow porch and 2 front windows that had been boarded from the inside. The roofline sagged slightly at one corner, but it didn't look like it was about to collapse. The closure sign was still there on the front door, a standard notice, laminated and stapled to a board. The door itself looked intact. I checked the frame, I checked the lock hardware, no obvious pry marks. Then I walked around back. The rear wall had a small window near the ground that looked like it once ventilated a crawl space. It was covered with a metal grate and screws. I ran my fingers over the grate out of habit, checking if it was loose. It wasn't. I kept moving, doing what I came to do. That's when I noticed the footprints. Not big, clear boot prints like in mud, more like pressed leaf litter where someone had walked recently enough that the leaves hadn't fully settled back. They weren't all over the place, just a subtle line around one side of the cabin leading toward the front porch. People do wander around closed buildings. It's not unusual. Some people like taking pictures. Some people like snooping. Still, it was worth noting. I went back to the front door and checked it again. The deadbolt was engaged. I tested the knob. Solid. I should have stopped there, taken my notes, and headed back out. But as I stood on the porch, I noticed something through a narrow gap between the door and the frame. Not a view into the cabin, just a sliver of interior darkness. And in that sliver, I saw fabric. Not dusty old curtains or cobwebs, something synthetic and modern-looking like nylon. It caught my attention because this cabin was supposed to be empty. I leaned closer and tried to angle my eye, but the gap didn't give much. Just a hint of color inside. I stood there for a moment, running through my options. My instructions were not to go inside. At the same time, if someone had gotten in and left personal belongings, that wasn't something to ignore. If the place was being used, we needed to know. I radioed my supervisor. The call went through, but her response was choppy and delayed. I tried again. Same problem. I checked my phone out of habit, no signal. The cabin sat in one of those pockets where the terrain blocks everything. You learn quickly which sections of the district are like that. I stared at the door again and made a decision I told myself was still within the rules. I wasn't going to explore the cabin. I was going to open it just enough to confirm whether it had been compromised, take a quick photo, and shut it again. I had a key ring for various gates and outbuildings. It included this cabin. Most trainees didn't carry keys yet, but I'd been assigned a set because I was doing solo checks, and my supervisor trusted me to follow protocol. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open a few inches. The smell inside hit first. Not rot or animal waste like you might expect. It smelled stale, but underneath it there was something that didn't belong. human body odor mixed with something like cheap soap. I opened the door wider and stopped on the threshold. The interior was dim, but not pitch black. Light leaked in through the cracks around boarded windows. The room was mostly empty. A metal desk pushed against one wall, a couple of old chairs stacked, dust across the floor, and in the middle of the room, near where a wood stove used to be, there was a sleeping bag. Not a sleeping bag someone forgot 10 years ago. A modern sleeping bag, dark blue, laid out as if someone had just crawled out of it. It wasn't neatly rolled. It was partially unzipped, the way you leave it when you're getting up and expect to return. Next to it was a plastic grocery bag with something inside that looked like packaged food. I didn't step in. I stood on the porch with the door open and my hand on the knob, watching the sleeping bag like it might move. There were no visible footprints in the dust leading to it. That part bothered me because it meant whoever had been inside either moved carefully or the dust wasn't as thick as it looked. I took a photo from the doorway, then another, closer, without leaning in much. I backed up, shut the door, and locked it. Then I tried my radio again. I moved away from the cabin and walked toward a slight rise, holding the radio up like it would help. This time I got through. I told my supervisor what I'd found. A pause. Then her voice came through clearer. "Did you go inside?" "No," I said. I opened the door enough to see. There's a sleeping bag on the floor. Looks recent. Food bag next to it. "Lock it back," she said. "Already did." "Good. Get back to the truck," she said. "Don't stay there." "I'm about 40 minutes out," I said. "Head back now," she repeated. "We'll log it and send someone out." I should have done exactly that, but I didn't. This is the part that makes me sound like an idiot, and I've replayed it enough times to know how it looks from the outside. The reason I didn't leave immediately was simple: weather. As I started walking back, the sky shifted quickly. What had been bright and warm became overcast in a way that didn't match the forecast I'd checked that morning. The wind picked up through the canopy. You could smell rain before it arrived. I was still a long walk from my vehicle, and I didn't love the idea of being caught on the open trail in a sudden storm with potential lightning in this terrain. It wasn't a mountain ridge, but it was exposed in spots. I stopped under a thicker patch of trees and listened. Distant thunder. Faint, but there. I stood there weighing choices. I knew the cabin wasn't supposed to be used. I knew I'd just found evidence someone had been using it anyway. At the same time, the cabin was shelter. Solid walls and a roof. I told myself I could do one thing: wait out the worst of the weather on the porch, not inside, and then continue once the storm passed. I walked back toward the cabin, staying annoyed with myself the whole way, like irritation could substitute for good judgment. The first heavy drops started as I reached the porch. Within minutes, it turned into a steady downpour. I stood under the porch overhang, not inside the building, with my rain jacket zipped up and my radio tucked in close. The wind pushed rain sideways enough that I still got damp. I tried the radio again. It worked, but the channel was busy. Someone else was reporting a downed tree on another trail. I listened for a minute and then turned the volume down. The storm made everything louder and quieter at the same time. Rain hammered the roof. The forest noise flattened into one constant sound. I stayed on the porch longer than I meant to. At some point, the temperature dropped enough that I started shivering slightly in my wet sleeves. I looked at the door and then away again, trying not to make that decision. I told myself I wasn't going inside. Then I told myself I'd be inside only long enough to get dry and wait for the worst to pass. In my head, that still sounded like a reasonable choice. I unlocked the door and stepped in. I stayed close to the entrance, keeping the porch light from the open door behind me. I didn't walk deeper into the cabin. I didn't touch the sleeping bag, but I could see it clearly now. The fabric had a sheen to it that dust-covered gear doesn't have. There were small bits of pine needle stuck to it like it had been carried in recently. The grocery bag beside it had a torn top, like someone had been reaching in and out. I closed the door behind me and locked it. Not because I wanted to trap myself in there, but because I didn't want to be standing in a building with an unlocked door while the storm masked every sound outside. I stood there listening. The storm outside drowned everything. I checked my phone again. Still no signal. The cabin felt colder than I expected. no insulation, no heat source, just damp wood and stale air. I kept my headlamp in my hand but didn't turn it on. I didn't want the bright spot of light announcing movement through the cracks in the boarded windows. I sat down in one of the old chairs near the door, keeping the sleeping bag in my peripheral vision. I set my pack on my lap. The idea of someone using that cabin didn't automatically mean they were nearby. People leave things behind. People stash gear. People do dumb stuff. I repeated that to myself as the storm went on. Eventually, the rain eased. The sound changed from heavy impact to lighter dripping. When it got quiet enough, I heard something else. A sound close to the cabin wall. Not scratching. Not footsteps. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing just on the other side of the wall near where I was sitting. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough that I didn't have to guess what it was. I held still, listening. The breathing continued. It stayed in the same place, as if whoever was outside wasn't moving along the wall, just standing there. My first thought was that it could be an animal. Then I realized how wrong that sounded. Animals don't breathe like that against a wall. You don't hear a deer or a bear standing still with its face near the boards. I shifted slightly in the chair, trying to do it quietly. The breathing stopped. I stayed still. A few seconds passed, then it started again. Closer, like the person outside had leaned in. I didn't speak. I didn't turn on my headlamp. I reached for my radio slowly. My fingers fumbled the button because my hands were damp and my grip wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. I pressed transmit. Static. I tried again, turning the radio slightly like changing the angle would help. More static. The cabin sat in a dead zone. I already knew that. I just didn't want to accept it at that moment. The breathing continued. I stared at the door and then at the sleeping bag. The simplest explanation was also the one I didn't want to think about. The sleeping bag belonged to the person outside, which meant they had been in that cabin recently enough that it still mattered to them, and they were close enough now to stand against the wall and listen. I stood up slowly from the chair. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. The breathing stopped again immediately. That reaction told me I wasn't imagining it. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could manage, keeping my hand near the deadbolt. I didn't unlock it. I didn't open it. I just stood there, listening hard enough that it felt like my ears hurt. Outside, the forest was quiet after the storm. Dripping branches, distant insects, but no wind now. Then I heard a soft sound near the porch, a shift of weight on wood. The kind of sound a person makes when they step carefully. I held my breath without meaning to. Another soft step. Then nothing. I didn't know where the person was. The porch wrapped only a few feet around the front. If someone stood just to the side of the door, I wouldn't see them unless I opened it. I backed away from the door and moved toward the center of the room, still keeping my eyes on the sleeping bag. I wanted to get out of the cabin. That felt obvious, but getting out meant stepping onto the porch and then onto the trail, in a place where I'd already lost signal. I also couldn't ignore what my supervisor told me. Don't stay there. I pulled my headlamp from my hand, clicked it on briefly, and aimed it at the sleeping bag. The zipper pull was looped with a small piece of paracord. That's common. A lot of people do it so they can find the zipper with gloves on. But it looked too clean to have been sitting in an abandoned cabin for long. I turned the light off again quickly. I didn't want to advertise where I was. I waited until I was sure the person wasn't moving on the porch anymore. I listened for a full minute without hearing another step. Then I made myself move. I unlocked the deadbolt, opened the door just enough to slip through, and stepped out onto the porch. The air felt cooler after the storm. The forest smelled sharp and wet. I didn't look around slowly. I scanned quickly, left, right, down the steps. No one visible. I stepped off the porch and started walking back the way I came, fast but not sprinting. I kept my head down, watching the trail for slick spots, but I also kept listening behind me. I didn't hear footsteps following. That didn't mean anything. The ground was soft now, and sound didn't carry the same way. I kept moving until I reached the rise where my radio had worked earlier. I keyed the mic and tried again. This time, I got through. My voice sounded tighter than I meant it to, but it was clear enough. I told my supervisor I was leaving the cabin area, that someone was nearby, and that I needed someone to meet me at the trailhead. She told me to keep moving and stay on the line as much as possible. The rest of the hike back felt longer than it should have. The trail looked the same as it had earlier, but my attention stayed locked on every bend and every patch of thicker brush. When I finally reached the truck, my supervisor's vehicle was already there. She hadn't waited for a second report. She had driven out as soon as she got my call. I climbed into my truck and locked the door, then sat there watching the trailhead. A second ranger arrived a few minutes later. They asked me what I saw and heard, and I told them exactly, without trying to make it dramatic. The sleeping bag, the food bag, the breathing against the wall, the steps on the porch. They went back in as a team, not alone. I didn't go with them. I stayed at the trailhead, drinking water and trying to settle my breathing back into something normal. They returned later, and the first thing they said was, "The sleeping bag is gone." I asked if they were sure they were at the right cabin. They were sure. They told me the cabin was empty. No sleeping bag, no grocery bag, no obvious new trash. The door was still locked when they arrived, which meant either it had been locked behind someone, or whoever removed the sleeping bag locked it again afterward. They walked the perimeter and found disturbed ground near the side wall where the bushes were thicker, but nothing that proved a direction of travel. No person found. No clear tracks once they got beyond the immediate area. We filed reports. We documented it. The next week, the district made a plan to secure the cabin more aggressively. Metal plates, additional locks, possibly removing the interior ladder access if there was any. They also told trainees not to do solo checks in that section until further notice. I went back to regular trail work after that. The cabin stayed on my map, but it changed categories in my mind. It stopped being old structure I have to check and became place someone is using. And the part that bothered me most wasn't that someone had been sleeping there. It was how quickly the evidence disappeared, like the person using it had been close enough to hear us coming and had plenty of time to clean up before anyone else arrived. Out in the woods, you're exposed. No walls, no doors, no locks. And if that tension stayed with you, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss the next nightmare, and tell us which encounter would have made you leave immediately. But if you think walls automatically make you safer, you might want to see what happens next. Click now to watch 4 disturbing home invasion horror stories, because sometimes the danger already knows the way inside. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.